Hello, everybody. I don't know if anybody is here yet. Yeah, we got 3 folks. Hi, we're just getting set up. We're going to start here in a few minutes. I'm going to give people a couple more minutes to get here. Since it's the first session, I think it's going to take everyone a minute to figure out how to get on the live video. So I'll give it like 3-4 minutes. In the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourself in the comments. Let us know where you're from, what your languages are, and anything else you want to tell us about yourself. We're really happy you joined us. And please pardon me a minute. I'm going to try and get this set up on my phone so I can actually read your comments while I'm streaming. So if you've just joined us, we're just getting set up. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes, and then we will get started after everybody has a chance to figure out how the live stream works. So don't worry, I'm not ignoring y'all, just getting this set up, giving people time to get here. All right, 19 folks. We're getting a good crowd here. Hello, just give it a couple more minutes. We will start shortly. And if you're just joining us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the comments. Tell us your name, what languages you work with or speak, and where you're from, and maybe what time it is there. I am in Portland, Oregon, United States, and it is about 7 in the evening here, so it's dark, but I imagine this is actually early morning for a lot of y'all, so let us know what you're doing. You having some coffee? You having your evening meal? And I have almost got it set up on my phone so I can read your comments as I am presenting. But in the meantime, we have 2 of our other organizers in the stream, Zach and Shirley. So if you have any technical problems, you have any questions about what is happening, just ask Zach and Shirley in the chat. They can help you out. Because right now, I can't really see what you're typing while I'm presenting. All right, cool. Now I can see what you're typing. This is great. And I think we'll get started here in a second. I think it's about 6 past. So we will see if anybody else wants to join a bit late. But in the meantime, we will kick this off. All right, so let's get started. Oh, cool. Looks like we have some folks from the Philippines, from Brazil, Australia, Bangladesh. Wow, everywhere. This is so cool. Arizona, Hawaii, fantastic. Oh, we got another Portlander here. Nice. All right, well, it looks like we have a great group of people from all around the world, and I'm really excited to share with y'all and learn about your language work. So, today we're just going to be giving a general introduction to this topic. What are endangered languages? Why would we document them? And what exactly is language documentation? So, as we get started, I'll just introduce myself to kick things off. Hello, my name is Anna Belew. I am the outreach coordinator for the Endangered Languages Project, and I need to update this slide because exciting news. I am no longer a PhD candidate, I am a full doctor. So I now have my PhD from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And for the next 8 weeks, we're going to be hosting this workshop on language documentation between the Endangered Languages Project and the Language Documentation Training Center at the University of Hawaii. That is where Zach and Shirley are based, so give them a big hello. They are in Honolulu. And each week, a different person is going to lead a workshop on a specific topic in language documentation. So each week, we're going to talk about something more specific, like making dictionaries, making audio recordings, phonology, that kind of thing. So a little bit of administrative stuff as we get started. First off, if you haven't yet registered on the Google form, we would really appreciate it if you did that. That helps us keep track of who's participating, where you're from, what kind of things you want to learn, and it helps us tailor the course to your interests and needs. Also, this semester is going to be a little different than past ones in exciting ways, in positive ways. We are going to have some presentations from participants at the end. So we're going to ask y'all if you'd like to give really short presentations, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, about your language, where you're from, and what kind of work you are doing to document your language. Because so far it's been sort of 8 of us talking to y'all, getting feedback, but we would like to give you the opportunity to present to the entire group as well. And finally, one more thing. If you are currently working in language revitalization, the Endangered Languages Project is working on a big old new project around revitalization, and we would love for you to help us out by taking this survey. We're working on a big survey to understand what people are doing and what is working in language revitalization, so there is a link here in the slides. All right, a little more technical stuff and we're going to dive in. You ready? So this video is currently live. There's a slight delay. So maybe up to a couple of minutes after I say something, you will see it on the video stream. So if you type something immediately after you see me say it, it will take a few minutes between you seeing me and me receiving your comment. So if you make a comment and I don't answer, I'm not ignoring you. It's not you. It's just a delay on the video feed. And if you have any technical problems during this, please talk to Zach or Shirley. And if you can't attend the live streams, so if right now it's like 3 a.m. where you are, no problem. If you can't make the live sessions, all of these sessions will be recorded and put up on the Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. So no worries, you can always watch afterwards. And the final technical thing, I know that I have a very strong American accent, so if ever I am talking too fast or you can't understand me, please just ask me to slow down. I'll talk a little slower. All right, so let's dive in to one of my favorite topics, linguistic diversity and language endangerment. So how many languages, let's get some votes, how many languages do y'all think exist in the world? I'll wait for comments. I'll see if I can see you typing in response. Any guesses about the total number of languages on this planet? No, okay. I think maybe the delay is too long for any real interactivity. Oh, Alistair knows. Yep. Alistair says 7,000 plus. Yes, indeed. Yumi, that's a great guess. 300 is a lot of languages, but it is less than a tenth of how many languages exist. So, there are about 7,000 languages that we know of. There are probably more because it's very difficult to get accurate counts of this kind of thing. But of all of these languages in the world, the majority of them aren't spoken by very large populations. So, a popular statistic you'll see is that 96% of all languages are spoken by about 4% of the world's population, which means the vast majority of languages have really small speaker populations. And then a few languages, the biggest 4% of languages, are spoken by 96% of people in the world. So you got your giant languages like Hindi and English and Mandarin and Spanish and Arabic, and they take up most of the world's population. So when we talk about endangered languages, this is a term maybe you're more familiar with in the realm of biological entities. We talk about endangered species, we talk about endangered ecosystems, but actually languages face pretty similar threats to their vitality as species and ecosystems do. And it means sort of the same thing. It means there is a very real risk that those languages will cease to be spoken in the future, whether it's very, very soon or maybe in a few generations. And we know that this happens, right? Some people, when I talk to them about this, they can't believe a language could just stop being spoken. They think languages are eternal, but no. Many hundreds of languages have stopped being spoken in the last just 60 years or so. And these are only the languages that we know about. There are many more languages that have fallen silent, and the outside world just doesn't know that. I wrote a book chapter on it that is linked here in the slides if you're interested. And today, about 46% of the world's languages are currently endangered to some degree. And that is a staggering number of languages. That is around 3,400 languages that currently face threats to their vitality. Why? Why is this happening? What is it that's causing language endangerment to happen at this pace, which actually is the fastest and broadest scope of language loss in all of known human history is happening right now. But why is this? What causes language endangerment? Well, something I like to start with is to acknowledge that, here's some fancy words for it, the factors determining obsolescence of language are non-linguistic, in the terms of one of the early linguistic anthropologists who studied this. But that basically means, in plain language, that languages become endangered for reasons that have nothing to do with the language itself. So languages don't stop being spoken because they're too complicated or too simple. They don't stop being spoken because they're too hard to learn, right? Human children are amazing. They can learn literally any language very easily. Babies are like little sponges for languages. So there's no such thing as a language that's too hard for a baby to learn. And also languages don't become endangered because they're not logical or pretty enough. That doesn't even make sense. And they certainly don't become endangered because they are primitive or because they don't work in the modern world, right? There's no such thing, linguistically speaking, as a primitive language. All languages are capable of expressing the full range of human experience. And if you don't have a word in your language for email or computer, you either make one up or borrow them, just like every other language does. So there's nothing within a language itself that causes it to become endangered. So what actually does cause a language to become endangered? Well, of course, language endangerment is fundamentally a social issue. And so it's caused by systemic issues that affect the people who speak those languages. So we're going to talk about some very broad categories of causes of language endangerment. This is a really complicated issue, and so these are simplifications, but this is sort of a simple introductory look at it. So the first big category of causes is what I like to call the really bad stuff. Physical factors that threaten the people who speak a language. So this includes things like war, disease, natural disasters, even terrible things like genocide, settlement colonialism, right? If someone goes, takes all your land, and tells you, okay, you either have to die or go live somewhere else. Forced assimilation, if they take all your kids and say you're not allowed to speak your language anymore. This is a category we might call physical factors or linguicide. So these certainly cause language endangerment and loss, but not always. There are many instances of language endangerment where none of these things have happened recently. Another category of factors is what we might call economic factors, right? If you need to make a living using a different language, it can cause pressure on your own language. So this category of factors includes things like urbanization. If previously you lived in a village where everyone spoke your language, but now more and more outsiders are moving in and bringing a dominant language. This includes migration and rural exodus, as they call it. So if you're no longer able to make a living in your village and you have to go to a city where everyone speaks a different language, you may lose your language. This also includes the destruction of people's ability to make a living in their traditional ways. If you are forced to integrate into the cash economy, as they call it, if you have to go get a job in an office or driving a bus, and you have to speak the dominant language to do that, that can put a lot of pressure on your own language. And again, this is a very common factor in language loss around the world, but not always, not always. Another category is sort of political and legal pressure on a language. So maybe it is actually illegal to speak your language where you live. This is a real thing. There are countries where you cannot speak certain languages. Maybe it's not legal to use your language in school or in the government or in churches. There's that sort of overt repression, but then there's also sort of just neglect, governmental neglect, right? So maybe there's no funding for schooling in your language. Maybe there are no legal rights around the use of your language. There's no infrastructure for keeping your language strong. These are also pretty common factors in language loss. For example, there is a language spoken in Russia called Udmurt, and it has been losing ground to Russian in the legal and educational system recently. And a couple of years ago, there was a tragic case where an Udmurt scholar actually committed suicide in front of the state council building to protest the increasing use of Russian in schools and a language policy that would hurt the Udmurt language. So that's a common factor as well, but again, it doesn't play into every case. And then finally, there's one big category that we might just call socio-linguistic factors, attitude factors. Because when you come down to it, language loss, language endangerment, like we said, it's a social issue, and it has to do with the choices people make, right? That doesn't mean people always have good choices available. They often make choices under terrible pressure and injustice. But in some cases, people choose to move to a dominant language for reasons like their attitudes towards their own language. They feel it's more prestigious to speak a different language. They feel that they have a better chance at climbing the social ladder if they speak a different language, right? I'm sure many of you might have seen this in your own communities. Maybe there's a language that makes you feel more educated or prestigious or whatever. And this is a very complicated topic. We're going to talk about it more later. And finally, one thing you might hear sometimes is that there are killer languages, big languages that just wipe out smaller ones. Like English is sometimes called a killer language. And I want to point out that while languages like English and Spanish and Mandarin do displace smaller languages, it's not because English is a killer. It's because the people who speak English generally have more political and economic and demographic power than speakers of other languages. And this just gets back again once more to the fact that language endangerment is in many ways a social issue and an issue of power. But we'll talk more about that later too, because it's a pretty complicated topic. Anyway, in almost every case, language endangerment is some mix of these categories. There's some social pressure, there's some economic pressure, there's some political pressure, maybe there's some trauma, right? There's some historical violence or warfare. There's often a big mix of all of these things. And it's also important to point out that language endangerment is a scale. It's not just a yes or no question. It's not a, this language is endangered, this one's not. It's a scale from the worst case, which is dormant, if no one speaks a language anymore at all. So Gagaju in Australia currently doesn't have any native speakers. And then you get critically endangered languages that are in great danger if they have just a small number, maybe of elderly speakers. And then it sort of moves into the middle ground of endangerment where there is risk, but there is a larger population of speaker, maybe even some younger folks still. And finally, then you get the languages that face challenges to their vitality, but are still pretty strong. So like Sasak has 2 million speakers in Indonesia, including children. And while it does have risks and challenges to its vitality, it's still in a pretty strong position. So it's a scale. So hopefully if you are in this webinar, we already agree that languages are important and that language loss is a serious issue that we should address somehow. And of course, we all agree that Indigenous, endangered, and underdocumented languages matter for all kinds of reasons. This is something that maybe you would have to convince your family members of, your fellow community members. There are a lot of folks who have an attitude of, who really cares? Why does this matter? Just let them go. But it's important to point out that language matters for reasons far beyond words and grammar. It's not only linguists who care about language loss. So the loss of language is tied really closely to the loss of identity and even physical well-being for a lot of folks. For example, there's a study in Canada a few years ago that showed that First Nations youth who had access to learning their Indigenous languages had much, much lower suicide rates. And I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of you around the world, that access to your own language has given you benefits to your well-being. And if you'd like to share about your experiences, maybe with physical or mental health related to language, please put it in the comments if you're comfortable. I would love to hear about it. But there's also a lot of research showing that physical health outcomes are closely tied to use of one's Indigenous language. So lower diabetes rates, longer life expectancies, just better health all around. Languages can save your life. Of course, there's art. There's the arts and humanities angle. It's important to have access to poetry and song and writing and storytelling in your mother tongue, in the languages that mean the most to you, right? I'm a native English speaker. I can read poetry in French. I speak okay French. I understand it. But it doesn't feel the same way as it does in English, as it does in my own native language. And obviously English is not endangered, but I imagine that some languages just hit closer to home emotionally. And then of course there's the fact that the United Nations has declared language a human right. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples declares that the use and development of a people's own language is their right under international law. This is not really enforceable, unfortunately. There are countries that have not signed on to this declaration, but in the eyes of the United Nations, languages matter. And finally, there's the simple fact that languages encode a lot of important knowledge, both social and cultural and identity knowledge, but also scientific knowledge. Uh, Things like what plants grow well together might be expressed by a very specific verb in your language, or there might be names for species of insects that outside science has no idea that even exist. There is a ton of great research about biological diversity and linguistic diversity and how closely they're related. And so loss of language ties into loss of a lot of incredibly crucial information that could help a lot of people. So I will stop there because I feel like I could rant about this for a very long time. I will not. We're just going to keep going and say 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages, but the United Nations recognized that 1 year is not enough for an issue this big. And so last year, or no, this year, they declared the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which will be 2022 through 2032. That is an entire 10-year period set aside by UNESCO to work on the endangered languages issue. And language endangerment, it should be said, usually happens on a generational basis. It usually happens from one generation to the next. It's not often that a language stops being spoken by everyone all at once. So I want you to think a little bit about the language situation in your community. Do kids around you speak your language as well or as often as older people? And do parents usually transmit your language to their kids? Do most parents speak that language to their children? You don't have to answer right now, just think it over and maybe we can talk about it at the end in the question session. There's also a few questions. If you want to think about them and talk later, maybe post in the Facebook group. I'd love to know what you've noticed about the state of your language in your community. How is its vitality level? How do you feel about it? How do other people in your community feel about it? Is it easy to use your language on the internet? Can you use Facebook in your language? And do you have any goals for the use or preservation or promotion or revitalization of your language? Just think about it. Think about it for later. How do we identify which languages are endangered? How do we figure out if that term applies to a language? Well, we can't really know for sure what's going to happen to any given language in the future. But linguists tend to assess the state of a language based on a few factors, such as, are kids learning it, right? Because if no kids are learning the language, there will come a time in the next couple of generations when all the speakers pass away. We also look at how many speakers there are. A language with a small population is not necessarily endangered, but it does face a lot of risks more concretely, right? It's easier for 2,000 people to stop speaking a language than it is to 2 million people, and they're more susceptible to demographic pressures. We also look at whether people are using the language in a lot of parts of their life. So you usually see that when a language is severely endangered, the areas in which it's used, what we call the domains of use, they tend to shrink. Not always, but often. So you'll go from people using the language all the time, at home, at work, in the market, and then over time it will shrink, often to just at home. And then sometimes a language will shrink so far that it's only used for, say, specific ceremonies or maybe informal circumstances, right? And finally, we also look at whether there are other factors threatening this language. So are there laws against using it? Are there policies that make it difficult for use in schools or education or government? Are there environmental changes? Is climate change likely to affect speakers' living situation in the near future? And so on. So we look at all of the things about a language's context and determine whether it's facing serious threats to its vitality that way. There's a link to an article about determining levels of language endangerment here in the slides. And I will post the slides in the group as soon as we're done. So if you want to know if your language is endangered, and if so, how endangered it is, you can visit the ELP website at endangeredlanguages.com and see what the catalog of endangered languages says about the status of your language. Or if you don't think you speak an endangered language, if you, like me, are an English speaker, you can still visit ELP and see what languages are endangered near you or in any specific country. But This all sounds very grim and very depressing, but there is good news. The good news is that awareness of this issue is higher probably than it's ever been, and people around the world are stepping up to do the work to revitalize and promote their languages. So people around the world are noticing this issue, and they're taking the steps necessary to bring their languages back from the edge. So what can we do? I mean, I think that's why most of us are here, right? We want to do something about this issue. And one of the things that we can do is language documentation. That's why we're all here. We're here to learn about language documentation. And in the classic paper that sort of defines language documentation for a lot of linguists, it's defined as creating a lasting multi-purpose record of a language. That's kind of an academic way to put it, so what does that actually mean? Well, it means that you make recordings of many different aspects of a language and how it's used, right? So these can be audio or video or even just writing things down. We try, where possible, to use professional recording equipment so that the records we make are high quality. I'm sure many of you have probably made an audio recording on a very low quality cell phone and it doesn't sound that good. And then you make an audio recording with a proper microphone and it sounds a lot better. So we want to use the equipment that's the best we can get our hands on. But if you don't have fancy recorders, don't worry. This webinar is going to cover the best ways to record things, even just with your cell phone, if that's all you got. And so once we have these records, part of the process of language documentation is, if you're comfortable with this, if the community agrees to it, putting it in an archive so that it can be preserved for a long time. And an archive is basically, it's sort of like a museum. It's a place that you put things for safekeeping in the long term, and they make a commitment to host and preserve these materials for as long as that university or that museum or whatever exists. Hopefully forever, hopefully 500 years, right? And another part of language documentation can be studying what we've recorded, figuring out how the language works, figuring out how the grammar works, how the sound system works, how the signing works. And a lot of people, when they get started, they're like, okay, I'm ready. I have my microphone. I'm ready to go. What do I record? And I hate that question because the real answer is everything. The answer is we document everything we can. But people want more specific answers than that. So generally we start with simple stuff like words and sentences. So almost every documentation project will involve words and sentences. You'll probably want to record things like conversations, speeches, important speech acts, by which we mean maybe there is a specific set of things you say at a wedding. Maybe there is a formula for settling disputes between people. Maybe there's a specific type of speech you make at a funeral. That's what we mean by speech acts, right? But the real answer is language documentation is about everything that people do with language. What we want to document is the full existence of this language and how people use it. And so this includes everything from songs and stories and proverbs, sort of the more traditional content you might think of as important to preserve, but it also includes how language is used in everyday life. So, you know, you making fun of your brother's hat, or your aunt's favorite joke, or your favorite recipe for cake, instructions on how to make fishing nets, you know, chat between a cashier and a customer at the store. It's all part of language documentation because almost everything we do is mediated through language. So if it involves someone speaking or signing, it is a legitimate thing to record for language documentation. Really, the answer is anything you think is important to preserve and share about your language and culture. That is a great thing to document. But, you know, let's be more specific. Generally, most documentation projects will involve the following things. So we'll talk about the sounds used in a spoken language, right? For example, English has the sound s and th and f, and not every language has those things. If we're talking about signed languages, which, important to note, these are just as much languages and they are just as much in need of documentation as spoken languages. So never forget, if you know of a sign language near you, it probably needs documentation. They tend to be very underdocumented. So we look at sounds or hand shapes. We call this phonology. We also look at what words exist in a language, and obviously there are thousands and thousands of words in most languages, so we record as many of them as we can. That's called the lexicon, the set of words that exist. We also look at the ways words are formed, how you put sounds together to make a word, how you put little word pieces together to make other words. We call that morphology. And then we also probably are going to want to document how to put words together to make a sentence, right? You can't just start speaking a language from a dictionary. You have to figure out how to put the words in the right order. So we call that syntax. And then, as we keep scaling up, we also talk about how sentences get put together to make speeches and conversations and stories. And this covers an area of study called discourse analysis, as well as all other kinds of research that look at how people talk to each other. And finally, we probably want to record some examples of the language being used. So conversations, stories, speeches, poems, whatever. You might call these texts. So these are the really basic components of most language documentation projects. But again, you can get creative. You can document whatever you want. You're not getting a grade here. And then once we go beyond the basics, like sounds and words and sentences, we can get into more specialized topics in language documentation. And there is a nearly infinite list of things that would be fascinating to document. So just off the top of my head, here are some real examples I know of documentation projects. Things like in-law languages and speech taboos. So in a lot of languages, you can't say the name of your father-in-law or his brothers or people who are related to you by marriage. So there are special speech systems for avoiding those words. That's fascinating. That's cool language documentation. You could document special vocabulary used in hunting. You could look at the way people in different social categories pronounce things differently, or maybe have different vocabulary. So maybe there is a word that women tend to pronounce a little differently than men, or that they say differently in a village 10 miles away. Also super cool language documentation. You could look at how kids learn to speak this language, right? So maybe you want to look at how they learn to pluralize nouns. You know, what kind of mistakes they make as they are growing up and learning to talk. That's a great thing to document. You could look at patterns of multilingualism, what languages people speak, how well they speak them. You could look at how to make up song melodies that interact with the tones in your language. That's such a fascinatingly specific topic. That's a real study. Or you could look at special kinds of language used in ritual or religion. That's one of my favorite topics of research as well. Anyway, you can think of your own. If something interests you, you should consider it a legitimate topic of language documentation, because everything we do with language is worthy of study and worthy of writing down and recording. Except, I do want to say, real quick, we don't document things that are not okay to share. There are some things, there are some pieces of knowledge, there are some types of speech that are secret or sacred, and we do not record them if they're not okay to record. I want to really emphasize that. I'm sure many of you know this, you already are on board, but it's really important to work closely with the other people who speak this language and get a good sense for what is allowed to be recorded and what is allowed to be shared with outsiders. So if you know, or someone tells you, that a specific word or a specific speech act is private, is secret, we don't record it and we don't ever share it. We always respect the wishes of the speech community on that. Cool. Let's be ethical language documenters, folks. And there's a lot to read about and to talk about on that topic. I left some references here, but please, if you have any other favorite topics on ethics or papers in language, hold on, I'm going to try that sentence again. If you have any other favorite papers on ethics in language documentation, please put them in the comments. All right, so real quick, again, you might want to be narrowing down your documentation focus. It's really overwhelming to think, okay, I should document everything, and everything is good documentation. So a lot of you have asked in the sign-up form, how do I best document my language? What should I record? And to get to that question, let's think about your goals, right? The potential outcomes you're trying to reach. So you might want to think about who this documentation is for. Are you doing this for learners who don't speak the language but want to? Are you doing this for people in your community who already do speak the language but they want a book of poems or songs? Are you doing this for linguists and researchers, biologists, ecologists? Right? These are all audiences you could serve with a single documentation project. So just think about who you want to be doing this for, and then think about which outcomes are your highest priority. So in your wildest dreams, what do you want to produce? Do you want to make a learner's grammar or a learner's guide? Do you want to make materials for people to practice with if they already speak a little bit? Do you want to make a dictionary? That's a pretty common goal. Maybe you want to make collection of stories. Maybe you want to make music CDs. Or do you want to just have a big bunch of records in an archive for long-term safekeeping? All of these are legitimate goals, and you probably have multiple goals. So think about it. Think carefully about what you're aiming to do, and that will help guide your documentation priorities. Right? In the best case scenario, we make documentation that everyone can use and everyone finds useful, but that's a very ambitious goal. We got to start somewhere. So also, just before we finish up, I want to say, many of you are probably saying, you're talking a lot about documentation. What about revitalization? Great question. Language revitalization is an equally important topic, and we are going to touch on it later in the semester. But this webinar is mostly about documentation, not because documentation is more important, but just because it's our area of specialty for this webinar. So it's important to note that documentation can be a useful step towards revitalization. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not two totally separate activities. The records you make in the process of language documentation can be used for language revitalization, and that's one of their most important uses, I think. And having good records of a language is also a very comforting safety net for a lot of people, right? Revitalization is a really hard process, and there's a lot of anxiety, especially if you have very few speakers who are elders. And there's a lot of comfort in knowing that there is a good record, there is a good base of information that you'll always have, even if, God forbid, all of your speakers pass away. So I guess the basic difference between them is that documentation is about creating these records of a language, and revitalization is about creating users or use of a language. And I wish I'd put a little arrow between documentation and revitalization, because documentation can often lead to revitalization. And also, finally, last point, a language doesn't have to be endangered for it to need documentation, right? Even if your language is super strong, people speak it all the time, kids are learning it, it still might need documentation. So there might just not be very many records of your language, even though people speak it constantly. So if you're wondering if your language is underdocumented, the answer is, if you don't speak English, Mandarin, Arabic, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, or Korean, it's probably somewhat underdocumented. These languages have huge databases of information about them, and most other languages don't. So there is always room to do more documentation of your language, I promise. So there are some exercises that I'd love for y'all to think about this week and discuss in the Facebook group if you want to. So is your language endangered, and how endangered is it? If your language is endangered, why do you think that is? What do you think the factors are that are causing it? What are the attitudes towards your language in your community? Are people proud? Are they kind of skeptical? Do they not care? Are there mixed feelings between different people? And this is probably a question that I'm most interested in hearing the answer to. Why does your language matter to you? What is most important about your language to you, to your family, your friends, your community? And what do you think is the most important thing to document? Or what things do you most want to document? What do you want to preserve and share about your language and culture most of all? Because again, language documentation is very open-ended. There is room for you to work on what you feel is most valuable. So look inside, figure out what you value most. All right, and now that I have largely finished what I have to say, I want to hear what you have to say. If you have any questions, I would love to answer them. There is a little bit of a delay on the video feed, so it may take me a second between you typing and me answering, but I will answer as many as I can in the next 15-20 minutes. And if you have any questions after this session is over, just put them in the Facebook group, and I and Zach and Shirley and lots of other people will be happy to talk to you. All right, I'm going to scroll up and see if I see any other questions. All right, so we got a question from Dennis. Could a language be endangered in a certain territory but not in total? My language, Finnish, has been spoken in Sweden for 1,000 years and it's endangered here, but not in total because there's a nation state in Finland. Yes, that's a great question, and this is a very common situation. So language endangerment, we said it's a spectrum, right? A language can be mildly to severely endangered, but that spectrum can be different in different places. A language can be really, really strong in one country or one state or even one town, and very endangered in a different country or state or town. This is actually a really, really common occurrence, and when it makes giving an overall endangerment assessment difficult for some languages, because you can say, well, it's very strong in India, but on the Tibetan side of the border, it's very endangered. And this is super common. Finnish is not alone in this case at all. And in fact, there are some interesting articles about regional language endangerment in Europe specifically. So if you'll send me a comment after this, I will dig those up for you. All right, other questions? Can I share a link to the endangered language document I mentioned? Oh gosh, I mentioned so many documents. Which one did you mean, Robbie? If it was the, let's see, if it was the one that that gave the definition of language endangerment or of language documentation, that would be Nicholas Himmelman's 1998 paper. Shirley and Zach, if you could like paste in a link to that, I would appreciate it. Yeah, but I'll wait for you to specify which paper you meant, Robbie. Let's see, other questions. I will wait for the delay between me talking and y'all typing. It's always hard to do this talk in 45 minutes because I think I could talk for about 45 hours. I never feel like I said everything I wanted to say, but I hope I gave you the basics. Any other questions? Okay, an ELP doc or web page. Let's scroll up and find out. If you are, oh yes, okay, probably this article on how we assess language endangerment. Was that the one? If that's the one, yeah, if you just Google Lee and Van Way 2016, you'll probably find it. I will also post these slides as soon as we're done talking, and you can click the link in the slides. All right. All right. Alistair, can you share some practical steps to engage those in the community? That is a very good question. Especially, I believe you're in a context where most people are not particularly interested in the language or aware of it. I think a lot of people have had great success with digital activism campaigns in cases where there's not very much community engagement yet. So even just an interesting Instagram account that posts little graphics, maybe with a word or a little fact about the language, might get people started to think about the existence of it and the challenges to its vitality. Sometimes the first step is just making people aware that the issue exists. If you'd like any guidance beyond that step, if there's any specific challenge you're facing with getting community investment, feel free to ask and we can talk about it. Let's see, Yumi, where do you begin when you've never done the work? Gosh. Well, I mean, really, first you start by finding speakers. That's kind of the key first step. If it's your own language or it's the language of a community you belong to, you'll probably have an easier time finding speakers. If you don't have access to the speakers of a particular language, but you're really interested in documenting it, your first step is going to have to be making connections and building relationships. So it's generally not recommended to just show up with a microphone in a village and say, hey, guess what? I am here to document your language. I mean, it's a little rude, it's a little pushy. You can try it, but I don't recommend it. The first thing you want to do is get in touch with somebody and say, would you like me to work on this? Would you like any assistance? Can I offer my time for this? And you'll probably need to spend a long time explaining why you want to do this and what it is you want to do and how anyone would benefit from it. That's probably your first step. If you have any other specific questions or I have totally missed your question, let me know. Does ELP need volunteers at this time? I mean, yes, we actually are likely to be starting an internship program in the next couple months. So I will post info about that. Yeah, we love folks to get involved. The best thing you can do at this moment is, like I just said, get people aware of the issue of language loss and language revitalization. Get the word out there that our world is incredibly linguistically diverse, and there are serious threats to that, and there are ways we can help. Just start spreading awareness on your own time if you can. Krishna, some languages naturally die because they become outdated. Yes, but we have to unpack that a lot. We have to figure out what we mean by naturally die, right? Because a language isn't a living thing, really. It's a social practice, so living things die. All living things die biologically. That's inevitable. But a social practice can go on as long as there are people to do it, right? And so a language, as a social practice, could theoretically continue for the entire existence of humanity. Something always happens to cause a language to stop being spoken. And what that is ranges from the abominable, like genocide, to the just kind of mundane. Maybe the language changes into another language over time, like Latin turning into French and Italian and Spanish. So we have to figure out what it means when we say a language dies naturally and what it means when a language becomes outdated. So we can discuss that further if y'all are interested. Barsine, which continent has the most loss of languages? Is there any documentation on that? That's a great question. I love this question because, yes, I wrote a whole article about that. I will put a copy of it in the Facebook group. But basically, if we look at statistical overviews of language loss around the world, the places we see the most language endangerment and language loss are North America and Australia. And 3 guesses as to why that is. It's settlement colonialism, right? When English settlers and European settlers showed up in those places, The bad stuff happened. The really bad stuff happened. We saw widespread genocide and disease and dispossession of land, and a lot of terrible things happened to the people in those places, and that's the reason we see the most language loss in those places. So yeah, it's definitely North America and Australia where we see the most language loss. Um, yeah. Let's see. As a living system, Krishna says, as a living system, a language grows and becomes old, and it has several daughter languages. The people speak the new ones, and the old language dies. What do I think about this situation? Yeah, yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at with Latin, right? That's a situation where if we keep on with the biological metaphor of languages dying, that's a situation where the language had kids and died of old age, if this is a metaphor, right? When we talk about endangered languages, in most cases, the languages that are at risk aren't just changing into new languages. They are being cut off. It's like someone, this is a silly metaphor. It's like someone dying before they have children, right? And so that's generally what we see with the global scale of language endangerment today is a language a language family just stops. It doesn't evolve, it doesn't keep going, it doesn't change, it just stops. And this is what makes this moment in time very much different from, as far as we know, most of previous human history, right? As far as we know, for the most part, in the past, for the last several 100,000 years, languages have generally evolved and merged and adapted in all the cool ways that languages do, and they haven't just undergone massive die-offs like we are currently experiencing with species as well. So what makes language endangerment today different is, yeah, there are no descendant languages, there are no daughter languages as we call them, there's just a stop. Yeah. It's super complicated. We can talk more about it in the group if you want, but yeah. Let's see. Oh, hello, Adi. How's it going? Samir asks how to start documenting Surmi speech community with only 150 speakers only 150 speakers left. That is difficult. Yeah, 150 is a pretty small population. But one thing I want to stress is that it is never too late. It is never too late, even if you only have one speaker left, even if you have 0 living speakers. It's never too late to start revitalizing your language. And if you have living speakers, it's definitely not too late to document the language. So how to start? Gosh. Well, like I said, a good place to start is always words and sentences. So start recording and writing down as many words and sentences as you can. It's okay if the language doesn't have a writing system. You can make audio recordings, and if you want to write it down, you can either use just whatever makes sense to you, or you can learn the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is what linguists do. But really, the thing to do in the case of Surmi, honestly, just get started. Get started while there are still a good number of speakers living. Just sit with them with a recorder. Ask if you can record some conversations, some stories, just some words, whatever they want to share. Just get started making those records. Don't wait. Don't worry about doing it perfectly. There was a famous language activist from the Blackfeet people here in the United States, and he said, never ask permission to work for your language. Just go and do it now. If you have 150 speakers, this is a very critical situation. This is a time-sensitive situation. So just get started. And if you want to chat more about what you're doing, please, I will be happy to talk about it anytime. Let's see. Robbie says, it's interesting because we have language family trees. We should have language family photos. Yeah, I like that idea. There are a lot of cool visualizations, actually, of sort of how languages descend from each other. I'm going to type in a link to one right now. It's an interesting project that gives you sort of interactive language family trees for all of the world's languages. So there is a link to you right there. Barcine says, I'd love to read your dissertation. Okay, I will put a link up in the group. Gosh, Let's see. George says we have started with less than 100 speakers and have started documenting. Yes, great work, George. Get started. I'm very, very glad that you're doing this work. Let's see. Bama Rita asks, I'm wondering if you have any research in innate language. Ah, you mean sort of the innateness hypothesis, the concept that human babies are born with some elements of language in their brains already? That's a pretty controversial topic among linguists, and it is not really my specialty. I try to stay out of that fight. But I think most linguists do agree that everyone is born with at least the capacity to learn language. There's not very much agreement on whether there are any parts of language hardwired in. Some people think that we learn language just like we learn any other patterns or behaviors. Some people think that there is something specifically about language in our brains. I don't have a strong opinion either way, but there's a lot of research you could read. Jorge asks, is it possible to document a language if you don't speak that language? Yes, absolutely. So I work on documenting a language called Iasa. It's spoken in southern Cameroon, and I speak it very, very poorly. I never ever spoke it before I started doing documentation. And what you'll have to do, probably, is use a language that is shared between you and the speakers. So if the people who speak this language also speak Portuguese, and so do you can do the documentation using Portuguese as the mediator language. Oh, cool. Alistair has a link about Daryl Kipp. Yes, I'm so glad that you were posting that in there. Oh, okay. Be Marita's asking, no, Inate, the language of the Aita groups in the Philippines. I see. Okay, I totally misunderstood your question. I don't actually know very much about that language specifically. There may be some information about it on ELP. I would be happy to help you find more, or if you have some good research on it, please share. I would love to learn about it. Let's see. I don't know. I think that's all the questions y'all have asked so far. But please, if you have any other ones, feel free to ask. And Jorge, I do want to say, on your question about whether you can document a language without speaking it, there are a few linguists who have pioneered something they call monolingual fieldwork. So basically you show up not speaking the language at all, and you try to learn it on a very basic level the way a baby would or a child, right? You kind of point at things, you go like, and then someone will tell you a word, but you won't know whether they're saying water or bottle or plastic or pink or what, or letters. So you have to kind of figure it out as you go. It's a very challenging method, but some people feel pretty strongly that monolingual fieldwork is both more effective because you don't get other languages mixed up in the process, and perhaps more ethical because you're not bringing in a dominant language to a community that's already being pressured by that language. So I think monolingual fieldwork is really interesting. I have not tried it myself. I work through French in the language documentation I do. All right, any other questions, folks? I'm going to give it a couple more minutes to let you type them if you got them. And also feel free if you have just stories you want to share or thoughts or opinions. I love talking about language documentation, so I will be happy to hear any of it. And also, thank you all for being here. It looks like it's very late at night for some of you, and I really appreciate you showing up, even if it's a weird hour in your time zone. And thank you so much for asking these great questions and coming to learn with us this semester. I'm really excited about it. And while I'm waiting for any final questions, just a preview for next week. So next week, again, we'll meet at Friday at 4 p.m. Hawaii time, which is UTC -10 this time right here. So next week, Jacob Hakim from the University of Hawaii will talk about audio and video recording, even if you don't have fancy equipment. So since most of us are going to want to start out making basic recordings, either of voices or video recordings, we want to know the best ways to do that, both in terms of where to put the microphone, how to set up a video camera, things like getting good sound quality. So we'll talk about all that next week so that you can get started with some hands-on documentation recording work. Let's see. Debbie asks, are there any projects documenting Acateco in Guatemala? Off the top of my head, I'd say I don't know, but almost certainly. I think Guatemala is actually a fairly well-served area of the world as far as language documentation. There are many good documentation initiatives for Mayan languages, and actually Central America has a lot of really great documentation that either already exists or is in progress. Clearly there is a lot more to do, but it's fairly well covered as far as the languages of the world go, right? There have been some estimates about how well documented the world's languages currently are. There's a great sort of bibliography that examines the most and least documented language families by Harold Hammerstrom. So I will paste a link in the group for that as well if you're interested. But yeah, Acateco, I'm sure there is a documentation project for it, and I can help you dig that up if you want. Bemarita says you're in the process of research about Inate, and if you finish the research, I'll be glad to share it with you. Awesome! Even if you don't finish it, even if it is a work in progress and everyone involved is comfortable sharing it, I think we would all love to learn a little more. Because, yeah, Aita languages are really fascinating to me and a lot of linguists. Yeah, I don't know if people outside the Philippines know much about them, so if you want to post a little bit in the group about the language and the community, I think that would be really interesting for a lot of folks. All right, folks, I'm going to give it till about 10 after the hour, 5:10 Hawaii time, till we call it for tonight. But any other questions, feel free. I will answer them. And thanks again to all of y'all for showing up to support and document and celebrate your languages. I love to be surrounded by people who love the world's languages. This is great. Debbie says, I'm an elementary school teacher and it kills me to watch the death of the parents' languages when the children won't learn them. Yes. Yeah. The sheer heartbreak of watching language transmission be disrupted is really a heck of a thing. It's hard to watch, especially when the parents really feel that loss really keenly. And as a teacher, I'm sure it's hard to know what to do in that situation other than maybe just sort of be generally encouraging of language diversity in your classroom, and sort of model a world where all languages are respected and valued. But I hope, and I'm sure that you're able to provide that environment for a lot of kids, and that's probably an important thing you're doing. So yeah, it's hard to see that break in transmission, but I bet you're doing what you can. All right. I think that'll wrap it up for this evening. So be sure to come back next week and Jacob will tell us all about great methods for recording. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or any thoughts, you can always put them in the Facebook group or contact me or Shirley or Zach. And I will see you all next week. I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful weekend. All right. Bye, everybody.